Let's talk about how to protect your assets during your lifetime first, and then we'll talk about how to protect your assets after your passing. I am sure that virtually everyone listening has heard the term trust. And that's what we're going to be talking about, because there are trust techniques, various types of trusts that are very effective ways to protect your assets. Now, whenever you hear the term trust, that actually should just kind of make you think, well, what kind of trust are we talking about? And maybe that's only as an estate planning and elder law attorney I will think that, but there are so many different types of trusts. So if you hear somebody say, oh, you can use a trust, the next step or the next question should be, well, tell me more. What kind of trust are you talking about? Because trusts have many different forms and many different protections or not, depending on the type of trust it is. So let's get started with what we first call lifetime trusts. In the legal world, they're also called inter vivos trusts. All that means is a trust you create during your lifetime. Now, within that category of lifetime trusts, you have irrevocable trusts and you have revocable trusts. We're going to start with the irrevocable trusts, and I'm going to describe what that is. An irrevocable trust is a trust that you create during your lifetime. And because it's irrevocable, this is something you are definitely going to want to work with an attorney on, because when anything is irrevocable, it's not supposed to be changeable, and you want to make sure you get it right the first time. So most trusts that are lifetime trusts are called revocable for good reason, but we're first focusing in on irrevocable trusts. And the reason for that is irrevocable trusts give you a great deal of asset protection. So an irrevocable trust is one that you create. You're the grantor, you're the one that creates it. You can even be the beneficiary of that trust and the trustee of that trust. Why are you creating this trust? Well, there's many reasons. One I mentioned is for asset protection. You take your assets and you put them into this trust. So because it's an irrevocable trust, you no longer own those assets at all, though you can be a beneficiary of those assets for most purposes. So think about when you do, it's tax season right now, when you do your tax returns, you use your social security number and you report on your assets and your income, etc. With an irrevocable trust, it does its own tax return. It has its own tax ID number because it is its own legal entity. If you give your assets to an irrevocable trust, you no longer own those assets. They are owned by the trust. Why would you do that? Well, there's some really good reasons why you would take your assets and you would put them into a trust, an irrevocable trust. Let's say you want to make sure that those assets are not subject to any creditors that you may have. You can put those assets into the trust. Now, don't get me wrong. If you already have those creditors coming after you and coming after those assets, you can't then say, oh, I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to put them in the trust. That's defrauded creditors. That's not going to work. I'm talking about the situation where you are concerned about future creditors and that you don't want them to have any access to your assets. So you put them in a trust. This is one of the best ways that you can make sure your wealth is protected from creditors. So creditors are a very big reason why people put money and assets into an irrevocable trust, because it does protect them, those assets. Another big reason people put money into an irrevocable trust is they want to get it out of their estate. By that I mean out of their what the federal government would consider, or the state would consider, the person's estate. And when I'm talking about estate, why I'm saying that is like upon death, you're probably familiar that there is an estate tax. If you take those assets and get them out of your own ownership and put them into an irrevocable trust, they are outside of your estate, and you're not going to be taxed on those when you pass. So minimizing estate taxes is a purpose that is well served by use of an irrevocable trust. And I don't want to get in, well, let me talk a little bit about the estate tax laws. Right now in Washington State, we have a $2.193 million credit exclusion amount. The majority of states don't even have an estate tax, but we in Washington do. At the federal level, currently in 2023, it is $12,920,000 is the federal tax exclusion amount. So if you are in a state that has no estate tax, Idaho, for example, you can pass $12.92 million, and none of that is subject to an estate tax. Nonetheless, people want to put certain assets into an irrevocable trust because they are concerned that they are going to have a taxable estate. So what kind of assets would somebody put into an irrevocable trust if they think, oh boy, I'm going to have, a $20 million estate or a $30 million estate? Think about startup companies. Think about stocks that you think are going to go meteoric, for example. If you take those stocks and you put them into this irrevocable trust before they get all of that gain, well, then all of that growth in that asset is occurring not in your estate, but in this trust. And trust can be set up to go on and on and on. Dynasty trust, you might hear them called, legacy trust. They can be, you could set them up for the benefit of your children, your grandchildren, and it can go on for a number of years until at some point in time, the law says they can't go on any further. In Washington State, that's 151 years. So it seems like a long time. So one of the reasons to have an irrevocable trust is to minimize estate taxes. It also, and so what we're talking about right now are people that have significant assets, for example. You can put your assets into this trust, they are protected, they can grow, and then you can keep putting certain level of assets into it. In Washington, for example, we don't have a gift tax, so you can gift $12.92 million and pay no gift tax, and the federal government is fine with that as well because it's within the exclusion amount. You don't pay a gift tax. You're the recipient, either the trust or any person you might give it to, they don't pay any kind of a gift tax. So it's a good way to reduce your estate is by actually giving it away, and that is going to protect against the imposition of estate taxes. When you give assets to people, either during your lifetime or upon your death, then the federal government and the state is looking at it and saying, do we need to impose an estate tax? I do want to point out that charitable giving is a way to take your assets and give them to a cause that is near and dear to your heart, and there's no estate tax imposed when you give to charity. When you use something that's called a charitable remainder trust, you get to retain the income, but the asset goes out of your estate. So as you can tell, a lot of what I'm talking about right now with irrevocable trusts are people who are concerned, yes, perhaps about predators, but primarily they're concerned about protecting their wealth from estate taxes, and that occurs upon death. So even though you create it during your lifetime, it's a lifetime trust. It has an effect during your lifetime and upon your death.